Well, good evening, everybody. My name's Jeff Hunt, and I'd like to welcome you all to this BCS Wiltshire branch's first ever hybrid meeting. So I'm hoping that in addition to our studio audience here in Swindon, we're reaching out to potentially a worldwide audience. By the way, this is also another of our joint meetings with the BCS's Programme Management Specialist Group. Now, although this is our first hybrid meeting, it should actually have been our second. But our September meeting, which was due to be the first hybrid meeting, had to be put back to November because of the death of Her Majesty the Queen. Now, rather ironically, this postponed meeting was about to be the mechanics of organising and running a hybrid meeting. I'd like to point out that this meeting is going to be recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, please leave now, but we hope you don't. And also, if you've got any questions for our speaker, please record these in the chat function. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speaker for this evening, Amanda Coulthard. Amanda is an award-winning agility coach and consultant, but I'll let her tell you more about herself in a minute or so. Amanda's going to tell us about the steps that Moonpig took when attempting to apply agile working across the wider business beyond just technology and the lessons learned along the way. Amanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody, and thank you for tuning in. We start that again.
Yeah.
We might want to deal with that echo as well. Right, sorry, folks. Oh, we've got a bit of an echo. Is that better? Is that better? Yeah, there we go. I think that's right. Sorry about that, folks. Inevitable technical issues. So I was cheerily chatting away and somebody realized that for all of you guys remotely, I was muted and then I had an echo. So we will rewind and go back to the beginning. So I was just going to give you a little bit of background about myself and about Moonpig. So Moonpig is all about making people happy, basically creating these moments of joy through personalized cards. Back when I was working with Moonpig, they were still part of the photo box group, who collectively were the largest personalization business in Europe. Since then, Moonpig has actually split off from the photo box group, and they also acquired a company called Greets, who was essentially a Dutch Moonpig. So they're now a bigger card business. They've also floated on the stock exchange, launched very successfully. So they've gone on to sort of much bigger and better things. A little bit about me. So I'm a freelance business agility coach and consultant. So I obviously spent time with Moonpig. Later on, I went to work with Gusto, the recipe box company, Ovo Energy, Burberry and Bumble are also companies that I've worked with. While I was at Moonpig, I was there working there permanently, ultimately as the head of agile coaching, which was how I sort of got the opportunity to start looking at agile across the wider organization, which is what I'm going to talk about this evening. So in terms of what I'm going to cover, I'm going to talk a little bit about the backstory, how we got to the point of looking to adopt business agility, why we changed, and then literally how we changed. So in terms of the backstory, this is sort of where, if you like, the Moonpig's agile story began. So Moonpig first started looking at adopting agile ways of working in about 2013. This quite often surprises people. Moonpig was actually founded in the year 2000, so it's much older than people think it is. I think it just, because of the brand, it's sort of perceived as this eternally young company, but it was actually sort of born in the kind of pre-agile era. So, you know, it was 10 plus years later before they started to think about adopting agile. So the way they went about it, they hired, as I call it, a real product team. So they actually had a very strong team of product managers, an empowered product director sat as part of the C-suite, reported straight into the MD. So, you know, had a seat at the table, if you like, and a voice in the conversation. We had software developers and QAs working in a sort of Scrumban type model, a bit of a hybrid of Scrum and Kanban. Jira had been introduced. We were starting to use proper backlogs, that kind of thing. So that was the sort of first foray into it, if you like. Over the next 3 or 4 years, we really made huge steps in terms of how working in an agile way. So some of the things that we did was, firstly, investing in the platform and reducing technical debt. So over that sort of, you know, 13, 14 years that Moonpig had been growing, the technology had deteriorated. Let's say there was a lot of legacy technology, a lot of technical debt, needed a fair amount of sorting out and re-architecting. We also started to introduce continuous integration and delivery so we could speed up the release cycle. We moved from having teams of developers and QAs to having cross-functional engineers, so people that wrote, tested and deployed their own code. We had a big emphasis on extreme programming practices, things like pair programming and test-driven development, a lot of emphasis around software craftsmanship and writing really good quality code. Improve the team maturity. So we sort of got really good at Scrum and then started to move towards Kanban because it's a more continuous delivery model and it's much better for working in a lean way and testing concepts and experimenting. And we had reasonably empowered engineering teams as well. So we got to this point where agile in the product and tech world was actually working pretty well, but we got to the point where we almost had sort of two cultures. You have this agile product and tech, and then the rest of the business still worked in quite a different way and still had a, you know, if you like, a different ideology. So we sort of had these two cultures happening together. So this was one of the reasons that this whole kind of business agility conversation started, is people started looking at the way product and tech worked and going, well, you know, it's kind of seems to be quite a slick system and the levels of engagement were really good. Maybe these guys are on something. What could we do beyond tech? So in terms of the sort of why change, we sort of started, you know, talking about the fact that the world has moved on. And anytime I talk to anyone about the sort of the why agile question, these are a couple of stats that I like to quote. That firstly, 50% of companies that were in the Fortune 500 in 1995 had dropped off the list 10 years later in 2015. And the other one is that the average life cycle of a company back in the 1960s was roughly 70 years. Today, it's 15 years and it's falling. In other words, it's got much harder to survive and thrive in business. And that's really because technology has changed everything. So whether you consider yourself to be a technology company or not, whether you're a technology-driven company or not, we're all being impacted by technology. It's come along and disrupted industry. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Gary Hamel. He talks about how we have businesses with 21st century enabled technology, but 20th century management practices based on 19th century management principles. In other words, a lot of our ways of working are still very closely wedded to what came out of the Industrial Revolution. That drives a lot of the way we organize our businesses and a lot of the ways in which we lead and manage. But clearly, the world has moved on significantly since the Industrial Revolution. So the sort of why agile question is a little bit, well, it's time to sort of catch up to the technology that we've got now and the fact that the world has moved on. So that was some of the external factors. In terms of some of the internal factors, when I started talking to people outside of product and tech, people weren't particularly happy. When you looked at the actual engagement scores within product and tech, things like engagement, alignment, enablement were maybe double or even treble what they were other areas in the business. So, you know, not only did we have a sort of great way of working, we had much happier people as well. Whereas once you started to talk to people outside of product and tech, these were some of the things that people complained about: lack of clear objectives, too many objectives, plans not matching, lack of collaboration, lack of clarity and ownership, lack of communications, lack of trust, people working in silos. Nothing particularly new or original here, but that was the sort of thing people were talking about. So as well as going, okay, well, the world has moved on, we're also going, but people are not particularly happy internally with the way we're working. Whether or not agile is the answer, we know that what we're currently doing isn't right either. So what did we change and how did we go about it? So essentially what we wanted to achieve, I described as we wanted to be better, faster and happier. So in terms of better, the overall outcome was to try and increase ROI. So to invest less in features and products and services until we knew they were going to generate a good return on investment. So being much more experimental, testing concepts before we invested a lot in them. Faster, so essentially shorter cycle times, getting things in front of customers for feedback much sooner. And then of course happier, so increased engagement. So really getting some of those engagement, alignment, enablement scores up to where they were in product and tech, raising everybody's level. This was my sort of lightweight transformation roadmap, if you like. So the very first thing that we did was aligning, so reorganizing around goals, and I'll talk about this in all of these steps a little bit later on. But that first step, alignment. Second step was to look at working processes. So once we've aligned around these goals, how do we then work successfully to achieve them? Experimentation, so starting to be more customer focused, using data to guide and make decisions, being much more experimental, having this fail fast culture. And then finally, trying to adopt this real culture of learning. So growth mindset, collaborative learning, learning from one another, and also starting to develop T-shaped skills. So rather than having a lot of knowledge and experience in a very narrow discipline, to start to develop a broader skill set. So first step on the roadmap, alignment. So this was really about moving from functional to cross-functional teams. So those of you that are familiar with the agile world will know that cross-functional teams are a big part of it. I always find it helpful to talk a little bit about the difference between functional and cross-functional structures. So when it comes to functional structures, this is the way that we have traditionally been organized, and very much sort of mirrors the, if you like, the factory setting of the Industrial Revolution. So traditionally we organize by function. In other words, we organize people by what they do, by a particular discipline or skill set, or by particular output. And this model is optimized for resource efficiency. So the ideal when it comes to resource efficiency is 100% of people are 100% busy 100% of the time. No one's got time to be checking Facebook or anything like that. So while it's quite resource efficient and everyone's working at maximum capacity, the downside of it is it creates a lot of dependencies between teams. That creates a lot of reliance on project management to sort of manage the communications, to coordinate teams, to manage these dependencies. So when it comes to cross-functional structures, instead of organizing people by what they do, we organize them by what we want them to achieve. In other words, we organize them around goals and outcomes. We organize teams around a set of shared priorities. So rather than optimizing for resource efficiency, in other words, keeping everyone really busy, we're optimizing for flow efficiency. In other words, we're optimizing for the team to be able to move really fast. And flow efficiency means you are slightly less resource efficient. You will have a bit of slack in the system, and people won't be 100% busy 100% of the time. But that's actually much, much healthier, not just from a mental health point of view, but because it removes bottlenecks, which again helps with your speed. So what you end up with, if you get this right, is independent teams, no dependencies on anyone else. And the lack of those dependencies liberates teams to be able to move really quickly. So that's what we were trying to achieve, these independent teams with a shared goal, and they could go after that goal as fast as they wanted without having to rely on anybody else around them. So yeah, this idea of optimizing for flow efficiency, as I said, it's really about getting things in front of your customers faster, whether that's a digital product, whether that's marketing, whether that's a new service proposition. You want to find out sooner rather than later whether or not it's viable and whether or not it's going to be valuable. You want to figure that out before you've invested too much money in it. So you're trying to shorten the feedback loop. You're trying to learn earlier and fail faster. And that's why speed is so important, because the faster you learn, the faster you course correct, the less investment you waste. So in terms of how this actually looked at Moonpig, what we ended up with. So in terms of actually making the change, we started off with looking at the strategy of the company and going, okay, if this is our strategy, how do we then break that down into a set of goals that determine what it is we're trying to achieve? Once we'd identified what those goals were, then we could start saying, okay, if this is a goal that we're trying to achieve, what are the different skills that we're going to need in order to be able to achieve this goal? So we're able to start organizing people around these goals to make them as independent as possible. In terms of what we came up with, we used the Spotify model as inspiration. So I'm sure loads of you will have come across the Spotify model of tribes and squads. We very much copied the why rather than the what Spotify had done, but equally the language of it was very familiar. So we thought, well, we won't reinvent the wheel, we'll stick with the language. So we looked at tribes as having about 40 to 100 people aligned around a high level mission, a big strategic goal. And then within each tribe, we had smaller units, team units, effectively, that we call squads, which was closest to 8 to 10 people aligned around a more focused goal, which would support the tribe mission. One of the things we found as we were doing this, that sometimes we needed more than 8 to 10 people to achieve a particular goal, but equally, once you go above 8 to 10 people, the team size starts to get too big. You start to have a big coordination overhead. It's harder for that group to self-organize. So we had this challenge of how do we stay small but equally have the number of people we want? And that's when we came up with the concept of pods. So a pod was basically 2 squads with a common goal, 1 team but 2 individual work streams, and that was how we managed to get the balance between the two. And in terms of what we actually came up with, so our the tribes that we landed on were the product and service. So this was very much about customer missions. So this was the focus on the core proposition. So what is it people are actually coming to Moonpig for? What is it that we're offering people at Moonpig? And certainly at that point in time, it was very much about optimizing the product range. We had a separate tribe, which was all around growth, which was much more about business mission. So how do we leverage the products and services that we've already got? How do we get more people to use those services and buy those products more often? And then underneath that, we had what we called foundations. So at this point in time, Moonpig was starting to embark on a big replatforming project, completely rewriting and re-architecting the underlying platform. So they weren't necessarily contributing to any business goal, but that was essentially enablement for the future. If we improve the platform, that's going to allow us to develop much better products and services in the future. It's going to allow us to work much better. So those were the 3 high-level units that we divided into these 3 tribes. In terms of the squads themselves, we had a couple of key principles in terms of how we would organize a squad and what it should look like. So the very first thing was that it had to have a North Star metric, a long-lived mission. So not something that's going to be done in the next 3 months, but something like retention, for example. This is an ongoing goal that we're going to be thinking about for years to come. The second thing was that they would have autonomy to achieve the goal. So as a squad, they would figure out how they were going to achieve retention with as little interference as possible, if you like. They had to be resourced to achieve those goals independently. So if they were going after retention, they needed all the skills that they were going to need for that had to be within the squad. So again, not having any of those dependencies. And then we realized it was useful to firstly to have a squad lead. So somebody that was really thinking about the squad direction, not dictating, but being accountable, making sure that there was a direction, but leveraging all the skills and voices in the squad to figure out what that direction should be. So a lot of facilitation rather than dictatorship. The other thing we had was a sponsor. So that would be a member of the senior leadership team who was the kind of go-to for the squad lead. So if the squad lead's got blockers or challenges or needs advice or guidance or whatever, that's their go-to. And likewise, the sponsor is ultimately going to be accountable for the success of the squad. One of the things that was obviously loads of talk about when we moved to this model as well, what happens to functions when we become cross-functional? And the short answer is they don't disappear. They are maintained and they're still very important. So some of the things that you're looking at functions to do, firstly, to make sure you've got consistency, quality, excellence. So if you're part of the creative design community, that you've got a set of brand guidelines that everybody understands and everyone is working within, that you're using whatever tooling you think is right. But basically, however you do design, you're doing it in a really good way. Same goes for technology. What technology stack are we using? What are our engineering principles, etc. So these things are very much about the how. So if you look at the verticals there, those blue verticals represent the squad. So you've got a cross-functional team aligned around a goal. So that's very much alignment around what we're here to achieve. Whereas the horizontals in the pink, that's much more about the how we do it. So how we apply our skills within this context. The other thing that these horizontal functions are really good for is knowledge sharing and visibility, because you don't want to go from a world of functional silos to a whole new world of silos where every squad is a silo. And by maintaining those horizontal communities, it's a way of getting visibility across all of those different squads and what's happening in them. So when engineering get together, they hear about what all of the other squads are doing via their engineering colleagues. When UX designers get together and they're critiquing one another's work, same thing, they get visibility of what's happening in other squads. So it helps to prevent those silos forming. And then the other thing that lives within functions is recruitment, line management, personal development. It doesn't necessarily make sense for a creative designer to be line managing an engineer or vice versa. So these functions don't disappear, but they stop being responsible for what they're going to achieve, and more about how they use their skills. So excellence in a discipline rather than going after specific goals. So I'm going to just talk you through a case study, because it's always helpful to see what this looks like in practice. So I'm going to talk you through what we came up with as the retention pod. So the retention pod was part of the growth tribe. So they were a subset within the growth tribe. In their case, the goal was to increase frequency and retention. And this was one of those clear cases where we needed more than 8 to 10 people to look after this goal. So we had the retention squad, which was a mixture of product, engineering, and design. And then we had what we call the retention CRM squad, who looked after the email marketing side of things, email marketing being a big driver of frequency and retention. They also had a shared analyst that worked across both those teams. And one of the useful things with this model actually is we historically had always been under-resourced when it came to analysts, but actually, because you had a single goal that you're going after, it doesn't mean that doesn't matter that you've got 2 smaller teams working on it. The goal is the same, and therefore a lot of the analysis around it is the same. So while the overall pod had this goal of increasing frequency and retention, the individual squads had sort of lower level goals sat beneath that. So in terms of the product and engineering squad, the retention squad, they were very much focused on conversion. So once people get to the website or get to the app, how do we convert them? How do we get them to buy a card, pay for a card, buy a gift, pay for a gift, etc. Whereas the retention CRM squad we're looking more at the journey of getting people to the website in the first place. But the nice thing with having these two teams focused on a single goal is that they were looking at the whole end-to-end user experience. So from receiving an email in my inbox through to checkout, and collectively, everybody was thinking about how to optimize that entire journey. So that idea of a shared goal and working together to achieve that shared goal was a reality. You would have engineers coming up with ideas of how to improve click-through rate. You'd have creative designers in the CRM squad coming up with ideas of how to improve conversion. It didn't matter. We're all here to achieve the same goal. Good ideas come from everywhere. So it created this really nice cohesion because everybody was behind this shared goal. Nobody was precious about who was doing what. So that's a little bit about the breakdown. So you can see a little bit more clearly who was actually in the squad. So the one looking after conversion. So that was your kind of classic engineering squad, really, with UX designer embedded in there as well. And on the CRM side, obviously you had marketers, but also you had a creative designer and copywriter. So both of those teams having all of the skills that they need, the pod collectively having all of the skills that they needed. In terms of what their working process looked like, they recognized that as a pod, there were things where it made sense for everybody to be involved. And there were other things where actually they didn't need everyone to be involved. So what they would do really was align around the outcomes, align around the strategy and the ideas, and then work individually when it came to the actual execution. So right from the start, agreeing the goal, that was very much at pod level. Okay, our overall mission is to increase retention. What's the first goal we're going to set ourselves to help us go after that? Brainstorming and ranking ideas, again, everybody could be involved with that. Once we've actually got some ideas we want to start playing around with, and it's now time to start running experiments, we can do that at a squad level. If we're running an email experiment, we don't necessarily need engineers to help with it. Likewise, if we're running an experiment on the website, we don't need marketers to help with that. So that the execution could actually happen separately, but it was more the alignment on the why and the what. And then at the end of those cycles, everybody would come back together. They would talk about what they'd learned, and that would feed back into looking at brainstorming ideas, ranking ideas, and the whole cycle would start all over again. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call the operating framework, so the sort of bigger, if you like, organizational cadence. So rather than just how individual teams worked, how did the whole system work? So as I said earlier, one of the things that we wanted to do was to make sure that we avoided silos. So we wanted to look at what level of collaboration did we need between squads, and how could we make sure there was plenty of visibility and plenty of knowledge sharing. So some of the kind of key activities that we put in place. So the T kickoff, so Moonpig worked in thirds rather than quarters. So we thought it would be a good idea at the beginning of every third to have a little bit of a kickoff, so each team could talk about what their goal was going to be for that third, and some of the things that they were planning to do around that. We'd have a weekly squad leads stand up, which was literally just a quick 2 minutes around, this is what my team's doing in the next week. Useful for visibility, but also quite useful for alignment as well. Oh, well, if you guys are doing that, useful that I know about that because we're planning to do this. So a good way of sort of catching anything like that might bite. We had a fortnightly squad showcase. So this was just a show and tell. So getting teams to talk about what they've been doing in the previous fortnight, previous month, what they'd done, what they'd learned, what they were going to be going on to do, really just sort of knowledge sharing. We'd also do a monthly, what we called a retro of retros. So individual teams would be running retrospectives, but we'd get representatives from those teams to come and do a sort of overall retro, so that where there were issues between teams or issues with the wider system, we had a way of capturing those. And then the other thing that was happening is regular function meetings. So if you think back to that horizontal layer, this is about your design community coming together, or your engineering community coming together, or your analytics community coming together. So all of those things helped avoid silos. Also around visibility and knowledge sharing, leveraging tools to support us. So we put a lot of effort into Confluence, which was effectively the wiki that we had. So for each squad, we'd have a section for that squad with the people that are involved, the mission, the progress. So anybody could go and find out what any squad was up to, who was in the squad, what their mission was, how they were progressing towards it. We also had a campaign hub. So obviously marketing campaigns were a big thing that needed a lot of coordination. We'd also use Confluence to share results of experiments and A/B tests and that kind of thing. And then Jira for managing workflows and visibility. So that's a little bit about the, if you like, the operating system. So if you think back to my roadmap, I talked about this idea of, firstly, we wanted to align. So what I've just been talking about, that all fell out of that alignment piece and getting that working. I'm going to talk a little bit about introducing lean and agile working practices. So obviously we had this within product and engineering, but with a lot of the other squad members, this was much newer. So we started introducing more teams to using Jira, not necessarily because Jira is so wonderful, but just so they'd have a way to start visualizing workflows and they could start organizing themselves around it. So this is the board for the CRM retention squad with the different steps of their workflow, and like any other team, they just use this to coordinate and organize themselves, keep work moving, getting things done. Just as we did in engineering, we started measuring things like cycle time, throwing up data to help the team see how much they were getting done, where the bottlenecks were, things that they could do to improve. Getting better, so again, going back to my roadmap, starting with aligning and aligning around goals. Secondly, looking at getting faster. Now let's look at getting better. So this is where we started to introduce more experimentation. So this varied depending on the area. Some people were doing this at a much higher rate than others, depending on what goals they were trying to achieve. When you're looking at things like new propositions and services, you go through a much bigger discovery period, whereas when you're in the growth area, you're actually testing things very rapidly. You're creating a high volume of ideas, you're testing a high volume of ideas. So this idea of gathering and ranking ideas, having things to test. Testing and learning, so this was the tool that we were using for this, so we could see what tests we were planning, which tests were active, and then we had the analysis of those. And finally, getting happier, so focusing on values a little bit. So in terms of some of the behavior that supports business agility, so one of the things we realized is that we were going to need trust at scale. If you're going to have these highly autonomous teams, you need very high levels of trust. And I think for the most part, we were quite lucky to have that. There were maybe a couple of areas where it wasn't all that it could be, but given that we were just getting started with this, frankly, it wasn't bad. Most of the teams did have an awful lot of autonomy. I mean, they had a goal to pursue. They didn't necessarily have autonomy in deciding what their mission was going to be, but in terms of how they were going to achieve that mission, they had a lot of autonomy. Psychological safety was really important. So we wanted this culture of testing, learning, failing fast. You have to know you're safe to fail in that environment. And I think that was something that we actually did pretty well. So long as people were learning and adapting based on the learning, I think that was pretty well recognized. Visibility, I've talked quite a lot about some of the different ways in which we were knowledge sharing, preventing those silos. One of the things I used to talk about a lot was goals before roles. So trying to, firstly, to avoid pigeonholing individuals into particular roles, but also to challenge individuals not to think of themselves in terms of what I do. So not saying, well, I'm here to write code or I'm here to design things. To try and get everyone to think about, I am here to achieve this goal. Writing code is the skill that I bring to help with that, or design is the skill that I bring to help with that. So trying to encourage people to sort of think more broadly about how they could contribute, and to use this opportunity of being in a cross-functional team to pick up a wider set of skills from their peers. And actually we had one great example of this where we had a creative designer who started working in one of these cross-functional teams and started working more closely with the user experience designer. And he then actually went on to become a user experience designer himself. He went on to work for BT. So that was a really nice example of somebody expanding their skills, developing new skills, and progressing their career through it. And then finally, that idea of, you know, learning and encouraging a growth mindset. So trying to provide people not only with the tools to learn, but also with the time to learn, promoting this idea of learning being a good thing. So if I try and give you a bit of a summary. So in terms of why, so we were aiming to be better, faster and happier. How did we achieve that? So firstly, by aligning people around goals and outcomes, aligning people based on what we wanted them to achieve, making sure that those teams were autonomous and that they were independent, starting to leverage lean and agile principles and processes. So both in terms of being able to move faster and deliver faster, get that short feedback in place, but also to, once you've got that, the capability to deliver in short feedback cycles, to have that culture of experimentation and constant learning. So this was very much the sort of start of an ongoing journey. In terms of what I told you, it took us 2 or 3 iterations just to get to that point. It still wasn't perfect. There were still more things that we could have done, but we could sort of see that we were moving in the right direction. Things were, with every iteration, things were getting a little bit, or in some cases, not just a little bit better, in some cases, significantly better. In terms of some of the prerequisites, I think if you're, you know, looking at trying to do something similar, the first thing is to have executive sponsorship. If you know, we were very lucky in as much as we had a very open-minded MD who, you know, was really interested in exploring these ideas and could see the potential. So the guy at the top of the food chain, if you like, was putting his weight behind it, because you can't introduce a level of change that we did introduce without having that kind of sponsorship and commitment. And also it's got to be over a long period of time, because, you know, these changes are not sorts of things that are done in a couple of months. You also need, more generally, your leadership to be willing to change and drive a new culture. So, you know, letting teams be more autonomous, moving to that sort of managing by outcomes for a lot of leadership. That's a big change and it can be quite challenging. Having the buy-in and support from your HR team, they're obviously heavily influential in terms of what the culture is and what the org design looks like. So having them on side and yeah, supporting it. And then the sort of sustained investment. And sustained investment is not necessarily huge amounts of money, but it can be an investment of time to get it right. Because ultimately, if you invest in this, it's a strategic capability. You're setting yourself up as an organization to be more successful. So rather than sort of, you know, treating it as something that's a bit of a pain, if you can actually invest in it, it's going to make a difference to the success. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. If anyone is interested in learning a bit more about this, I've actually written a 12-part case study that goes into a lot of detail on all the steps, and you can find that on my Medium site. So that's betterfasterhappier.medium.com. And each blog post is about 5 to 10 minutes, and I think the whole thing adds up to an hour's worth of reading, but it's sort of cut into these bite-sized chunks, so it's not too overwhelming. So yeah, if you want to learn a little bit more about the Moonpig case study and go into it in a bit more detail, it's all there for you. So that brings me to the end of the talk. I don't know if we want to take questions.
I think we might have to go through your
Through mine?
Yeah.
I'm able to.
Right, where are we looking for?
Okay, so a lot of the chat is a lot of it about the background noise. We are right above an air conditioning. Right.
Have we actually got any questions? Were they all going to come through the
Chat.
chat?
Right. By the way, Keith.
Yes, so I guess the question would be, thanks for the presentation. Did you force squads to restructure, recycle membership after goals were achieved to avoid get more freshness, to avoid them getting stale?
No, I mean, there would always have been the option for people to move around, but there's a balance because it actually takes at least 6 months really for a squad to start to gel and develop that effective way of working and develop the relationships and to build trust and all of those kind of things. So you don't want to be, I mean, there are organizations that do sort of, you know, spin down and spin up on a regular basis. I've never been a fan of it because I think it takes quite a while for a team to find its feet, you know, the sort of whole forming, storming, norming. Yeah, if you've just got to norming and you're then dismantling the team and starting all over again. But yeah, there were, I mean, I wasn't there long enough really to hit one of those use cases. But I mean, certainly if you looked within product and engineering where we'd had cross-functional teams for a long time, people did sometimes want a new challenge. So yeah, there was the opportunity to recycle. And the other advantage of recycling is it's kind of quite a good way of cross-pollinating ways of working, because you go from one squad to another and you go, oh, well, in my old squad, we used to do this. And it stops squads sort of developing subcultures, if you like. So yeah, I think it would definitely have been on the cards, but rather than completely dismantling a team, maybe, you know, the odd person here and there moving around.
Amanda, I think I'm going to have to pass questions on to you because we've got a problem with the
no worries.
setup. Ian asks, slide 32, this seems a lot of meetings. How much did this take up?
Not a huge amount. Thinking back to what was on there, so a tea kickoff, so that's once every 4 months. A weekly squad leads catch up, that's 15 minutes once a week. Showcase, that's probably half an hour every fortnight. Retro of retros, an hour once a month. So yeah, I wouldn't say it was a particularly big overhead.
I don't want to correct you, but also within Scrum methodologies, they actually specify exactly how long you should be spending on each of the meetings. So a standard 15 minutes max.
Yeah, I mean, we weren't strictly following Scrum,
Yeah.
but yeah, you're right. Normally it would be.
That kind of leads me into a question, if that's all right. Where the thing I always find with agile is everybody's got their own opinion and flavor. Did you have problems with certain teams believing their agile was better than other teams?
No, not really. I think within product and engineering, we actually, because we didn't have siloed squads, we had a very strong engineering community, we had a very strong product community. So there really wasn't much us and them. And there was actually a fair amount of consistency in the way the teams worked, partly by design and partly by accident. But you'd find, you know, one team would start doing one thing. I'd mention to another team, oh, these guys have just started that. Oh yeah, that's a great idea. We'll start doing that. And to go back to your question about people moving between teams, you know, if you moved between a team, certainly within product and engineering at Moonpig, it was a bit like changing rooms in a hotel. The layout might be slightly different, but you knew how to turn on the taps, you knew what was in the mini bar, you know, you knew how the TV worked. That it wasn't a completely overwhelming experience. So certainly within product and engineering, there was really good alignment around what we were trying to achieve. And once it came to the wider business, they had no idea what agile was. It was a whole education piece. So, you know, they weren't particularly opinionated. And I think Moonpig generally, you know, from the point of view of its culture, was just an organization that didn't take itself too seriously. It did sort of naturally attract people without too much ego, which I think helped.
It does. Thank you.
A question from Enrico. How was the transition from Scrum to Kanban? What is the elements that you retain? How about holacracy?
The transition from Scrum to Kanban was reasonably straightforward, but I guess we did it in phases. So working in Scrum, we'd got to the point where we were working in 1 week sprints. So we were very good at breaking work down. We had a really good focus on finishing, which are the sort of two things that I think you need in order to be really good at doing Kanban. So it was a little bit riding a bicycle with the stabilizers on. And once you take the stabilizers off, you know, the teams wobbled a little bit for the first couple of weeks, but they course corrected pretty fast. I mean, they encountered a couple of the usual pitfalls that, you know, with no sprint deadline, they were taking longer to make decisions. Discussions were going on for ages. There was another team that fell into the trap of getting blocked, and instead of unblocking themselves, picking up the next thing and the next thing. But in both cases, the teams, you know, realized in a couple of weeks, oh, you know, we've shot ourselves in the foot here, and they corrected quickly and just moved on. So I wouldn't say that, I mean, in terms of what was retained, so we still did, I mean, I would say probably in some ways the only thing we got rid of really was doing sprint planning and having those, you know, regular planning sessions. And by this point we were doing continuous integration, we were doing trunk-based development, had feature toggling and so on, and actually that starts to become really irritating in a Scrum world. It was much easier once we moved to Kanban.
Well, unless anybody's got any more questions.
I just noticed one more. Oh, it's to me. Sorry, it's come through as a direct message. Stuart is asking, did you find that Moonpig had to recruit additional staff to accommodate the lower resource utilization that's achieved under this model? Yes and no is the answer to that. So I think one of the interesting things when you move into cross-functional teams is it doesn't create bottlenecks, but it does expose them. Oh, sorry, Stuart, got a real tickle in my throat. So one of the things that we recognized when we moved to this cross-functional model is that we were grossly under-resourced when it came to copywriters. So it wasn't a case of we were suddenly doing more copywriting, but once we tried to move into cross-functional squads, we recognized that actually we don't have enough copywriters to do the amount of copywriting that we actually require. That only became obvious when we moved into this cross-functional model. So we did have to hire extra people in areas like copy, but I wouldn't say that was caused by moving to a cross-functional model. We recognize the need for it by moving to a cross-functional model. But no, other than that, we didn't have to recruit additional staff. And a lot of people ask me that question around the lower resource utilization. It is lower resource utilization, but frankly, most people were pretty busy. We didn't have a lot of people sitting around twiddling their thumbs. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question. I think that's it.
That's it.
Quick question,
oh,
that's okay.
Yes, of course.
Where was the change driven from mainly? By?
Good question. So I first pitched it to the group chief product officer. So at this point in time, Moonpig was part of the Photobox group. So he was the CPO at group level, and thank you very much. He really liked the idea and said we ought to be doing this. So he then said to the Moonpig MD, I think you should be doing this. And he said, yeah, all right, we'll give it a go. So it did have some, you know, pretty serious executive sponsorship, but I would say I don't think it was forced on the MD at all. He was, you know, he was really on board with it, very enthusiastic about it. I mean, I think all of the leadership team were a little bit nervous, as you would be. It's an enormous change, and you know, some of them said it's a leap of faith. We don't know yet that this is going to work, but they were open-minded enough to give it a try.
I'll try and take that.
You take back control.
See me? I'll come and use you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
let's swap. Come and use mine.
Well, folks, this has been a learning experience because we've had some few technical problems because we were confronted with a setup that we weren't expecting before we walked into the building. So I apologise for any finger trouble. Also, for anybody who's been hearing an excessive amount of background noise, it's to do with some sound masking system in the BCS offices that we can't turn off. So apologies, and I hope it didn't spoil your enjoyment of an excellent lecture presentation from Amanda. And I'd like to thank her on everybody's behalf, and I'm sure we can have a good round of applause for the physical attendees. Please feel free to join in on the internet. And Amanda, I'd like to just present you with a small token of our appreciation. And thank you very much, and especially for coming out from London. And we've now got to get you back to Swindon Station in time to catch your train home. Those people on the internet, thank you very much for attending. We will be having our postponed hybrid meeting on how to arrange a hybrid meeting, which actually might be quite useful. And I think that's scheduled for the 22nd of November, and I will be sending out more details then. But as for tonight, thank you very much for attending. Go home safely, and hopefully we'll see you in November. Thank you. Bye-bye.